Hello, and welcome back to Headwaters Monday Science Lessons. Today, we're going to be building off of some of the things we did last week in episode 2, where you designed your own research project. Take a moment now and make sure that you've completed all the homework from last week before starting today's lesson. During today's science lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about why scientists are studying phenology, as well as take a moment to look at some of the patterns that you might see in the data you've been collecting for your own project. Let's start things off by building off of an example from last week that will help us understand why we study phenology. If you remember last week when I told you about the time that I collected butterflies and counted flowers to help understand butterfly migration, we're going to talk a bit more about that system now. Here is an example of some of the data that we collected for the project. As you can see, there are a list of flowers running down the column on the left, and then the highlighted blocks for each row is the time of year that those flowers are in bloom around where I live. As you can see, the woolly mule's ear flower are one of the first ones to bloom, and the mountain mint is one of the last ones to bloom in September. Now what we can do is, on top of this same chart that shows when flowers bloom, put a box that describes what time of year the butterflies typically migrate. As you can see, the butterflies tend to come through when there are lots of flowers for them to drink nectar out of and pollinate. On this next slide, you can see an example of a future scenario which shows why scientists are studying this question. Here we can see what might happen if flowers started to bloom earlier. Butterflies might not have the same access to flowers and the nectar that they eat in order to survive. If the butterflies don't shift their migration patterns too at the same way the plants might, this could be a big problem for both the butterflies and the plants. This is something that may or may not happen, but is a big reason why scientists are doing that type of research right now, so they could see what types of problems or changes might be happening to help us better adapt for future climates. As a scientist, this future scenario we're looking at makes me have a lot of different questions I want to answer. Things like, if the flowers bloom earlier, could the butterflies also migrate earlier? Or could other types of insects pollinate the flowers if the butterflies weren't around? Or maybe, could the butterflies migrate to different places, to some place where there are flowers, if climate continues to change like the way it is? As you can see from this last example, many things in nature are really interconnected, and the timing of when one organism develops affects many other organisms. Did you know that 90% of plants and flowers need an organism to pollinate them in order to reproduce? If the timing of when those plants develop and when the pollinators are active doesn't line up, we could miss out on all the flowers, fruits, and seeds that those plants produce. Many of the types of food that we eat need to be pollinated in order for those crops and other foods to make it to our grocery store shelves. So now that we've talked a little bit more about why phenology is an important thing to study, I'm going to take you outside into my backyard and show you the project that I've been working on. Hello everyone, we're out here in my backyard and I'm going to show you the phenology research project I've been working on over the past few days. As you can see, I've got a couple bushes back here. These are an alder tree. And my research question is whether alder trees here in the sun have more buds on them than alder trees that are over here in the shade. I'll show you our shady area in just a moment. But my prediction or hypothesis was that the other trees that are out here in the sun are going to have more buds on them than the trees in the shade, because plants need sun to live and do photosynthesis. I've got my clipboard with my data sheet here. I'm going to walk you through how I've been collecting data with the hope that it helps you in coming up with your own research project. So here's an example branch that I've been counting. Every time I go to a new tree, I count 4 branches on each tree. On each branch, I count how many buds like this have a bud on the end of them, and how many of them, like this one right here, don't have anything at all. By comparing the number, I can see which trees are developing the most. So this one here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buds on this tree out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So 7 out of 16 is what I'll write down for this one. So now I'm here at a shady tree right here. As you can see, sometimes science gets a little bushy like this. But what I'm going to do is do the exact same thing I just did on a sunny tree with this shady tree here, so I can compare my results. Now that I've counted 4 branches on a sunny tree and 4 branches on a shady tree, I'm going to repeat the same process, alternating between sun and shade, until I've completed all the replicates that I've come up with. Now that we've seen a couple examples of phenology projects and what they look like, we're going to work a bit on the project that you've been coming up with. The first thing we're going to do is start on how we organize our data. Here's a picture of my data sheet from the project that I've been working on outside. You see how every time I do my methods, I start on a different row, with each column as a different type of measurement that I've taken. Another thing that we can do here is take this pen and paper data sheet that we've been working on and put it into a computer. Having our data sheet on a computer will help us when we graph our data later on next week. When we're putting our data into a spreadsheet on the computer, it's really important that we only ever put numbers or letters in any one cell. Never put letters and numbers in both. If you have something with a unit like temperature, you can put the temperature unit, like Celsius, in the very top row, not next to every measurement. We do this because we only want numbers in any cell when we're making a graph of it. This will make a little bit more sense next week when we talk more about how to graph our data with a computer. The other thing a really nicely organized data sheet helps us do is plan out our replicates. As you can see here on my data sheet, I've got my replicates highlighted with each pair in the sun or the shade. This way it's really easy for me to count how many replicates I've already done and how many I still need to do to fully test my experiment. It's important here to remember that one pair of data measurements is one replicate. So if I measure a tree in the sun and a tree in the shade, that counts as one replicate. If I measure 8 trees, 4 in the sun, 4 in the shade, that counts as 4 replicates. Your job now is to plan out the number of replicates that you're going to be doing for the rest of this experiment through this week and next week. What I want you to do is to write out the furthest left column for your replicates on your data sheet so you know how many you have left to do. Now that we've organized our data and planned out our replicates, we can start thinking about how we're going to look for patterns in our data. One tool scientists use to do this is a graph. Before we get going too far, I have a question for you. Why do you think scientists make graphs? Take a moment and write out an answer of why you think scientists make graphs on your paper. So I came up with 2 main reasons on why I think scientists might make graphs. The first is that they help us see any patterns in our data. It can be a lot easier to see patterns in our data on a graph rather than just looking at a page full of numbers. The second reason why I think scientists make graphs is because it's a lot easier to share our findings with others. For the same reason it's easier to see patterns on a graph than a sheet of paper, it's a lot easier for us to communicate what we found with our research project when we show our data as a graph rather than a page full of numbers. We're going to talk a little bit about the types of graphs that you might use to show the data from your research project. Here are 2 data tables from different research projects that we can use to explore the different ways to graph data. On the left, we can see an experiment where students compared the number of insects in a forest area and a field area. At the very bottom, you can see they took an average of the number of insects in a forested area and the number of insects in a field area. On the right, we can see the data from a group that looked at how distance from water affects the number of plants. You can see they started near a body of water at 0 and counted the number of plants that were in a square meter. As they went further and further from the water, they counted the plants using the same method and plotted their data for 125 meters away from the river. As you can see here, we can kind of guess some of the patterns in these data tables, but it's hard to see just by looking at the numbers. On the next slide, we are going to show you graphs of these sets of data. One of them is going to be a bar graph, and the next is going to be a scatter or a dot plot. Can you guess which one will be which? The graph on the left is the bar graph, and the graph on the right is the scatter plot. As you can see, the bar graph shows the mean or average number of insects in a forested area versus in a field area. It's really easy to see that the field site had more insects than the forested site. On the right, we can see a scatter plot. As we can see, there were more plants near the water at 0 meters and fewer plants further from the water up to 125 meters. A key difference between a bar graph and a scatter plot is that a bar graph has one type of number in different categories, like the number of insects between 2 different locations. A scatter plot has numbers on both the x and the y-axis. You can see this one has the number of plants per meter on the y-axis and the distance from water on the x-axis. What I want you to do now is to sketch a graph of what you think your data will look like if your hypothesis is true. You don't have to plot exact numbers on your graph. Estimates are fine, but I do want you to put the units on each axis just like these example graphs. You will need to decide whether to use a bar graph or a scatter plot based on the types of measurements you have been taking. It's possible that you might be able to make multiple graphs with the data that you've been collecting. So please try to pick the graph or two graphs that are the most relevant to your research question. Alright, so that's all we have for today's lesson. But before we go, I wanted to go over the homework that you have for this coming week. The first and most important part of your homework is to go outside and collect more data. I want you to try and complete all the replicates you planned out during today's lesson by the time next Monday's lesson comes around. Be sure to organize your data in your spreadsheet, and if you have access to a computer, enter your data into a spreadsheet there. The second part of your homework assignment is to do some research on the plant or organism that you are studying. You can use the homework worksheet included below to help you through this process. We'll go over what this looks like now so that you can complete this on your own for homework. The first part of your homework worksheet is to figure out what type of plant you are studying if you haven't already determined this. If you can't find out what the actual species is, that's okay, but try and get as close as you can. You can use resources like the iNaturalist app to look for common plant types around you, as well as the National Phenology Network's website, or a local field guide. If you get really stuck, you can always email me a picture of the plant that you've been working on, and I can try and help you identify it. The second part of your homework assignment is to learn a little bit more about the plant that you've been studying. Use a reliable resource like an encyclopedia to investigate more about this plant. Things that are good to research are, what do we know about this plant's life cycle? What time of year does it develop? And what types of conditions does it mainly live in? The next part of your homework assignment asks you to write down some information about the type of area that you live in. What type of climate are you in? Is it a warmer climate? Something like the Mediterranean in the Bay Area? Or is it something colder and wetter like a deciduous forest in New England? Where you are might affect how plants around you grow, so it's important to describe the climate that you live in to your audience. The last part of your homework assignment is to describe the types of things that you think this plant might affect, or what types of things might affect this plant. If you have deer in your backyard that might eat some of the buds on the tree, you can write that down. Or maybe insects that will pollinate the flowers you've been studying. Make a list of the types of things that might affect your plant or could be affected by your plant. So that's everything we have for today's lesson. Nice work! You are well on your way to completing your very own scientific research project. If you have any questions with your homework, you can always reach out to me via email or join in to our Wednesday office hours.